I had always dreamed of moving to a quiet suburban neighborhood, one where families spent summer evenings on front porches, kids rode bicycles around cul-de-sacs, and neighbors knew one another well enough to share cups of sugar. That dream led me to Chestnut Grove, a place that looked picture-perfect from the outside. Its winding roads were lined with elegant maples, and each house possessed a pristine front yard, some with manicured lawns, others boasting small rose gardens bursting with color. Little did I know, Chestnut Grove was governed by a strict homeowners association, HOA. My real estate agent had mentioned it in passing, but I brushed it off. I assumed HOAs were just about collecting monthly fees for communal amenities like the neighborhood park and pool. I didn't realize the extent of the power they could wield, or the ways a single, ill-intentioned individual could twist such power to their advantage. That's how I first encountered Lucinda Farnsworth, a 50-something woman with sharply styled hair always pinned back in an immaculate bun. She was well known in Chestnut Grove for her controlling nature, but her outward persona was all prim smiles and concerned looks. She held a significant position in the Chestnut Grove Homeowners Association, the vice president of policy enforcement. From the moment she discovered I was moving in, she seemed to relish the idea of flexing her authority and proclaiming to the entire block, "We run a tight ship here." The neighbors secretly referred to her as Karen. Rumor had it that Lucinda's real name had once been publicly confused with Karen, and in the local coffee shops and hair salons, the nickname stuck. The whispered stories painted her as a nightmare, a meddler who would measure your grass height with a ruler, write citations for improperly placed mailboxes, and even comment on the color palette of your holiday decorations. I wasn't too worried. I had faced my share of difficult people before. In my professional life, I was a national philanthropist, though I often kept that part low-key. My wealth and philanthropic status came from a legacy of charitable endeavors and an organization I had founded, but I preferred to live quietly, without broadcasting my success. All I wanted was peace. Peace, however, would be the last thing I'd find in Chestnut Grove. Barely a week into my move, I found a stark, official-looking notice on my front door. Notice of violation. Date, September 12, 20XX. From the office of the Chestnut Grove HOA Vice President of Policy Enforcement. Violation. Failure to comply with the official trash can placement. Resolution required. Trash cans must be placed at the curb between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. on pickup day, then removed from site by 8 p.m. Fine. First warning, fine waived, but subsequent infractions will incur a fee of $50. I blinked, somewhat amused. I had literally moved in only days ago, and the trash pickup schedule was the last thing on my mind. They couldn't have knocked and let me know. Later that morning, I saw a neatly dressed woman marching around the neighborhood with a clipboard. Her posture was upright, determined. She looked like she was patrolling. Even at a distance, I knew. This was Lucinda Farnsworth, Karen. She spotted me in my driveway, gave a pinched smile, and strutted over. "Hello there. You must be the new resident in house number 37, correct?" She spoke with a crisp accent, her gaze scanning my front yard as if it were some test she needed to grade. "I'm Lucinda Farnsworth, Chestnut Grove HOA Vice President of Policy Enforcement. I placed a notice on your door about our trash can policy." "Nice to meet you," I said politely, though I could already sense her evaluating me. "Sorry about that. I'm still settling in, and I didn't realize the exact times." Lucinda nodded but cut me off. "The guidelines are detailed in our HOA handbook. Did your real estate agent provide it?" I thought back to the endless stack of documents I'd signed when buying the house. "I have a copy, yes. I'll read it thoroughly." "Excellent." She thrust out a hand. "We like to maintain order in Chestnut Grove. I do my best to ensure everyone abides by the rules. I'm sure you'll do just fine once you familiarize yourself. Welcome to the neighborhood." Her gaze lingered on me a moment longer before she turned, scribbling something on her clipboard. As she walked away, I caught a glimpse of a scowl, the polite veneer dropping for just an instant. A chill ran down my spine. I wondered if all my future interactions in this neighborhood would feel so tense. Despite the rocky start, I was still hopeful. A few days later, the Chestnut Grove Elementary hosted a bake sale to raise funds for the school library. Being fond of children's causes, I wanted to help. I baked dozens of muffins, brownies, and cupcakes. Early on Saturday morning, I loaded them into my car and drove to the school. The cafeteria was bustling with smiling parents, teachers, and kids setting up colorful tables. The moment I walked in, an older gentleman greeted me with a grin. "Hello, you must be the new neighbor on Chestnut Drive. I'm Marvin Henry. I live down the block. Thank you so much for bringing these treats." I smiled and introduced myself, feeling a wave of relief. Finally, a warm reception. As we arranged the baked goods, I noticed Lucinda Farnsworth across the room, chatting in hushed tones with another member of the HOA, a man named Gary Simmons. Her eyes darted to me occasionally, narrowing. I pretended not to notice, focusing instead on greeting the children and encouraging them to pick their favorites. The bake sale was off to a great start, and I was enjoying talking to my new neighbors. That's when I overheard a few hushed conversations among the volunteers. I heard Karen threaten to shut down the bake sale unless every table had a proper permit from the city. Someone told me she wrote a complaint about the school sign not matching the allowed color schemes for the neighborhood. She even tried to fine the principal last year because of balloons left on the fence after a graduation party. I frowned in disbelief. Could someone really be so petty? Just as I contemplated going over to speak to Lucinda, to break the ice or at least figure out her angle, she and Gary stopped their hushed conversation. Lucinda's face was stern. "I just want to ensure all guidelines are followed," she said to Gary loudly enough for half the room to hear. "If they aren't, we have to consider immediate action. The last thing we need is unscrupulous events tarnishing the reputation of Chestnut Grove." The remark sent a ripple through the volunteers. A teacher let out a stressed sigh, worried that the event might be shut down at any minute. I decided to step in. "Mrs. Farnsworth, might I ask if there's anything in particular you'd like us to address about this fundraiser? It's just a bake sale for the kids, but if we're missing any paperwork or permits, we'd be happy to sort that out." She turned to me, that polite smile crossing her lips but never reaching her eyes. "I appreciate the initiative, but rest assured, I've already spoken with the principal. I'm simply ensuring everything meets our standards." The principal, Mrs. Cortez, overheard. She joined our small circle, looking frazzled. "Everything is perfectly legal, Miss Farnsworth," she said. "We got the necessary city permit. We're raising money for new books for our library. We're not violating any local or state ordinances." Lucinda pursed her lips. "The last permit I reviewed was only for the use of the cafeteria. I'll need to verify whether it actually allows sales of goods on the property." Mrs. Cortez looked confused. "Sales of goods are typical for a bake sale. The city permit covers that. I can pull the copy if you need to see it." "I would." "Yes," Lucinda said. The principal sighed and quickly hurried off to fetch the paperwork. For a moment, everyone in the vicinity stared at Lucinda. Tension hung in the air. She seemed to enjoy this silent power, the ability to halt the day's festivities with a single question. But the principal returned within minutes, documents in hand, verifying everything was above board. Lucinda pursed her lips but had to concede. She gave me a tight-lipped nod and retreated to the corner with Gary to mutter about further steps for future events. The bake sale resumed, though the atmosphere felt noticeably strained. That evening, I realized that my initial sense of peaceful suburban life might end up overshadowed by Lucinda Farnsworth, the self-appointed gatekeeper of everything in Chestnut Grove. Back at home, I tried to settle into a routine. Each morning, I'd take a jog around the block, passing neighbors who offered friendly waves. But the more I chatted with them, the more negative stories I heard. Marcy Wheeler had been fined $100 for leaving a pink flamingo lawn ornament out too long after a birthday party. The Lopez family received a letter complaining that their front door color wasn't neighborhood approved. Brian O'Connor, who ran a small nonprofit from home, was threatened with legal action if he didn't remove the discreet sign from his mailbox advertising donation pickups. Each complaint, each petty fine, each official scolding, it all traced back to the same source, Lucinda Farnsworth. But what truly shocked me was when I learned about the food bank program that some residents had been quietly sponsoring. A group of charitable neighbors had organized monthly food drives to support local families in need, many of whom had children attending Chestnut Grove Elementary. They collaborated with the nearest city food bank and used a neighborhood clubhouse, funded by HOA fees, as a drop-off point for non-perishable donations. This had gone on smoothly for months. Then came Lucinda. One morning, volunteer coordinator Mrs. Diane Hogan found a thick envelope taped to the clubhouse door. It contained a cease and desist letter from the HOA board, stating that the monthly donation collections violated Section 14(b) of the Chestnut Grove Covenant, which apparently forbade any unauthorized use of HOA property for philanthropic or commercial activities. Karen had twisted that vague rule to claim that distributing free groceries counted as a commercial activity. Result: the monthly charity food drive was halted. People who needed those supplies were cut off overnight. The volunteers scrambled for alternatives, but the convenient clubhouse location was their central hub. It was devastating news for many. I heard the story from Brian O'Connor, who knew I was big on philanthropic work. I felt my stomach sink, a surge of anger mixing with heartbreak. "This can't stand," I said. "I'm sure the rest of the board can override her." Brian shrugged, frustration evident in his voice. "The rest of the board are either her close friends or too frightened to cross her. Whenever someone protests, she pulls out the covenant book, finds a random rule, and threatens them with big fines. People here don't have the time or money to fight legal battles, so they give in." That evening, I lay awake, thinking about all the families who counted on that monthly donation. How many kids would go without a decent meal this week because of one woman's warped sense of neighborhood standards? I decided that I couldn't just stand by. I had connections, resources, and a genuine desire to help. If Lucinda Farnsworth wanted a fight, then maybe it was time someone stood up to her and gave her more than she bargained for. Before making any grand moves, I knew I needed more information. It was easy to see that Lucinda liked to rule through intimidation, brandishing the HOA regulations like a sword. But why was she this way? Could her power trip be a front for something else? Research became my next step. A few calls to friendly neighbors gave me insight into her history. Lucinda had once been a struggling realtor, trying to sell houses in this very area. Apparently, an overbearing personality and a habit of correcting potential buyers' personal choices had sunk her career prospects. She'd pivoted into volunteer roles and then latched onto the HOA, quickly climbing the ranks. Now, as vice president of policy enforcement, she had found her domain. I also learned about the internal HOA structure: a president, a vice president, a treasurer, a secretary, and a group of board members. The president, Walter Givens, was a genial older man nearing retirement. People said he was mostly a figurehead, while Lucinda effectively called the shots. In a short time, I gathered plenty of personal stories from neighbors: how Lucinda had used legal threats, how she had turned minor disagreements into official HOA action. She had an uncanny ability to twist rules in her favor. But there was also talk that she had made questionable financial decisions. Although everything looked immaculate on the surface, some suspected she might be in debt, an expensive taste in jewelry, and frequent out-of-town trips hinting that she lived beyond her means. I wasn't looking for dirt to blackmail her. I simply wanted to understand what fueled her vendetta against anything she couldn't control, especially charity efforts that only brought good to the community. It made no logical sense. Unless, of course, she felt overshadowed by genuine generosity and didn't want her tight-fisted approach undermined. It was a puzzle. But as I watched how the entire neighborhood bent to her will, I knew this had gone on long enough. The day after I heard about the canceled monthly food drive, I invited Diane Hogan and Brian O'Connor to my house for coffee. We sat around my kitchen table while I poured us steaming mugs and set out a plate of cookies. Diane sighed, swirling her coffee. "Karen, it's what we call her. She's unstoppable. I've lived here for 10 years, and no one's been able to break her hold on the HOA board." Brian nodded in agreement. "I can't count how many times she's threatened me. I run a small nonprofit to help local veterans, and she's always on my case about running a business from home. I keep telling her it's not a business, it's a charity, but that just seems to provoke her more." I took a slow breath. "I'm not just a random neighbor. I have resources. I'm involved in larger philanthropic efforts around the state and even nationally. If I can help get the food bank operation going again, I will. But I need to know if you two would stand with me." Diane's eyes lit with cautious hope. "I'd do anything to get the donation drives back. We had families depending on us." Brian's brow furrowed. "Are you sure you want to poke the hornet's nest? She can make your life miserable. She's done it to a lot of people." I nodded resolutely. She already started with her petty trash can fines and shutting down the bake sale attempt. Though that didn't fully succeed, she tried. I'm not going to cower. If she wants to pit herself against something that benefits the community, then she'll have to face the consequences. Brian and Diane exchanged glances. Then Diane reached out, gently resting a hand on mine. "We're in. Let us know what you need." We spent the next hour discussing possible strategies. Legal. We could try to challenge her interpretation of the HOA covenant in court, but that would be expensive and time-consuming for average residents. Community organization. We could rally neighbors to vote her out of the HOA leadership. However, Lucinda carefully manipulated elections by controlling who had a voice. Many homeowners were either afraid or lacked the time to fight a war of proxies and votes. Public and media pressure. If I leveraged my connections, perhaps local news outlets or philanthropic organizations could spotlight the situation, exposing how a small-minded HOA tyrant was preventing charitable work. We decided a multi-pronged approach would be best. Start small, gather more supporters, and if she persisted in shutting us down, escalate with the help of local media. The three of us parted ways with renewed determination. Our first step was to resurrect the monthly food drive, but under a new banner and location. Diane made calls to a local church outside of Chestnut Grove's official boundaries. The church agreed to let us use their parking lot for a weekend drive. Word spread quickly. Although it wasn't as convenient as the neighborhood clubhouse, we still managed to collect a sizable amount of non-perishable items. Volunteers pitched in with trucks and SUVs to haul the food downtown to the main city food bank. Even though Lucinda had forced us to move out of the official neighborhood facility, the neighborhood spirit wouldn't be quashed. The success of that first relocated drive bolstered morale. People began to whisper that maybe the neighborhood could stand up to Lucinda if they united. Fueled by this momentum, we scheduled a second drive, which raised even more donations. Lucinda's reaction was swift. She started sending out official HOA newsletters with stern reminders. Residents are reminded that any official group activities or events must be cleared by the HOA board. Unauthorized gatherings remain subject to fines and legal repercussions. We maintain these rules to protect our community from potential liabilities. Legally, she had no jurisdiction over a church parking lot outside the neighborhood, but her menacing tone made some residents anxious. So Brian, Diane, and I organized more open conversations at local coffee shops, ensuring people understood that the HOA couldn't legally stop them from donating goods outside its property. And so, every month, our relocated drive grew bigger. We started to post flyers in local businesses, and with each success, we sensed Lucinda's anger simmering just beneath the surface. She would show up uninvited, clipboard in hand, scanning license plates of volunteers as if searching for violations. But off-site, she was powerless. Tensions reached a boiling point one Saturday morning, after we had just finished loading up 3 trucks full of canned goods, cereal boxes, and baby supplies. Lucinda strode into the church parking lot, flanked by 2 of her cronies from the HOA. She marched right up to our small registration table. "This is unacceptable," she spat, voice quivering with rage. "You are using Chestnut Grove's brand to advertise your events without board approval. That is a direct violation of the covenant for external representation." Brian scoffed. "We're not using the HOA's name at all. We only mention that volunteers are from the neighborhood. That's not a violation of anything." She glared at him, then turned to me, pointing an accusing finger. You're the ringleader. Don't think I haven't noticed you circumventing my authority. If you persist, I'll see to it that the HOA fines are stacked so high you'll regret ever stepping foot in our neighborhood." That was when I decided enough was enough. I let out a slow, measured breath. "Mrs. Farnsworth, if this is about me stepping on your toes, we can sit down with a neutral mediator and discuss it calmly. But if you think you can bully people out of doing good for the community, you're mistaken. This is bigger than you or me. I'm going to keep helping these families, and if you want to try to stop me, be my guest." Her face turned a deep shade of red. "You'll regret this," she hissed, pivoting on her heel and storming off. I had a feeling that storm was only beginning. Over the next few weeks, Lucinda used every bit of her HOA influence to harass me. I began to receive frequent violation notices for trivial things. Grass is 0.5 inches too long. Excessive yard lighting after 10 p.m. Unauthorized doormat design. Yes, she actually cited a rule about maintaining a tasteful aesthetic to question my perfectly ordinary welcome mat. It was laughable, but the fines attached were not. $50 here, $100 there, or warnings that my mailbox color was beyond the permitted shade of black. I paid some of the smaller fines to avoid a mounting legal headache, but it quickly became clear she was using them as a form of intimidation. I realized the day would come when I would have to challenge her in a more official capacity. Meanwhile, I stepped up my philanthropic efforts. I placed a few calls to connections in local media outlets. A reporter from the Chestnut Gazette expressed interest in covering the story about an HOA shutting down a charitable food drive. "That's a juicy angle," she said. We agreed to schedule an interview at the church parking lot during our next donation event. The day the article ran, titled "Local HOA Attempts to Halt Neighborhood Food Bank Efforts," the entire city took notice. The piece highlighted how petty restrictions affected families relying on donations. The piece did not yet name Lucinda personally, but it did mention an overzealous HOA official. Enough so that many within Chestnut Grove knew exactly who it was. And that's when Lucinda escalated to the next level. Late one night, well past midnight, I awoke to a startling sound. A series of loud bangs outside my front door. Heart pounding, I hurried downstairs. When I flipped on the porch light, I found my trash can strewn across the driveway, trash bags split open. At first, I assumed raccoons. But the way the cans were deliberately shoved into the middle of my driveway told me this wasn't just animals. Then I noticed a spatter of paint on my mailbox. The word "traitor" was scrawled in bright red. My stomach churned. It could have been random vandals, but the timing was too coincidental. Someone clearly wanted to send a message. The police took my statement, though they had little to go on. No cameras nearby, no witnesses. I suspected Lucinda either orchestrated it or stirred up some equally misguided folks who believed I was tarnishing the neighborhood's image. I refused to be intimidated. The next morning, I went outside with a bucket of soapy water and scrubbed that hateful word off my mailbox, refusing to let anger or fear get the best of me. If anything, it steeled my resolve. Later that afternoon, a city official visited me because of an anonymous tip that I was running an unlicensed commercial business out of my home. I politely invited him in, showed him around, and proved that all I had was a simple home office with no merchandise, no employees. He left, apologizing for the inconvenience, but it was clear that someone was pulling strings behind the scenes to make my life difficult. I realized then that Lucinda Farnsworth was fully prepared to wage a clandestine war. And if I wanted to protect the community, I would have to stand my ground. One crisp autumn Saturday, the church parking lot brimmed with boxes of food, children running about, and volunteers hustling to organize donations. Word had spread about the final event before winter. Families in need came by to pick up fresh produce and canned goods. A local produce company even donated a truckload of fresh fruit. As I was speaking with a local news crew who had arrived to document the drive, Lucinda pulled up in her pristine SUV. She stepped out, wearing a tight-lipped scowl, flanked again by Gary Simmons and another HOA crony. Cameras turned their way. Lucinda marched up to me, ignoring the cameras. "You," she snapped. "I warned you about representing Chestnut Grove in a public capacity. You're illegally organizing events under the false pretense of neighborhood sponsorship." I calmly replied, "We're not claiming it's an HOA-sponsored event. Everyone here came of their own free will." The reporter, sensing drama, trained the camera on Lucinda. "Ma'am, can you explain why you feel the need to stop residents from helping families in need?" Lucinda glared, her voice rising. "We have rules. There are reasons these regulations exist, to maintain the value and reputation of our properties, to keep out chaos. This so-called charity is operating without official oversight. There could be health code violations." A volunteer holding a crate of food overheard and barked, "Health code violations? We're giving out canned goods, lady." She ignored him. "As the HOA Vice President of Policy Enforcement, I will not allow this community to be tainted by unauthorized activities." She cast a pointed glare at me. "The fines and citations will continue, I assure you." At that moment, the camera lens zoomed in on her. The reporter pressed further. "Are you aware, Ms. Farnsworth, that your stance is putting local families, many of them your neighbors, in precarious situations? They rely on these donations. There's evidence to suggest you personally used HOA funds to hire private investigators to harass certain residents. Would you care to comment?" Lucinda's eyes widened. "That is a baseless lie," she shrieked, but her face gave away a hint of panic. She whipped toward me. You think you're so noble, playing the philanthropist. But you're just undermining the very fabric of Chestnut Grove. I nodded slowly. If the fabric you're defending is about punishing people for helping others, then I don't want any part of it. We're done here, Miss Farnsworth. You can take whatever legal route you want, but the entire city, and beyond, is watching. As if on cue, an older gentleman stepped out from the crowd, Walter Givens, the HOA president. He approached with a grave expression. Lucinda, we need to talk, he said quietly but firmly. The board has been getting complaints from dozens of residents. Our attorney is looking into potential misuse of HOA funds. We have to hold an emergency board meeting. Lucinda's face turned ashen. For once, she was speechless. She turned on her heel and stormed back to her SUV, her entourage trailing behind. The cameras captured every moment. That night, the story aired on local television. Headlines read, HOA official threatens to shut down neighborhood charity drive. In a city that prided itself on community spirit, the public outrage was immediate. In the following days, the HOA board convened. Rumors flew through the neighborhood. Investigators were looking into not just Lucinda's role in shutting down the food drives, but also how she might have personally profited from the board's funds over the years. Anonymous sources provided documents showing misappropriation. Lucinda allegedly channeled some HOA money into personal travel expenses. It didn't take long for local law enforcement to open a formal investigation. Chestnut Grove residents who had once been too frightened to speak now came forward en masse, sharing stories of intimidation, suspicious fines, and even questionable receipts for administrative services that never happened. Within a week, the evidence piled up. The final straw came when a city inspector discovered that Lucinda had forged official letters to the city, halting certain zoning permits that would have allowed the neighborhood clubhouse to be used for philanthropic events. It was fraud, and that's when the authorities stepped in. One crisp morning, 2 unmarked police cars arrived at Lucinda's stately house. Neighbors peered from their windows and behind hedges as the officers walked Lucinda out in handcuffs. Even in that moment, she struggled, shouting about her rights and how this was all a misunderstanding. But the camera phones of neighbors captured the scene, and the next day, the local news ran the footage. Lucinda Farnsworth, Chestnut Grove's self-appointed tyrant, was charged with embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. As the investigation deepened, they uncovered more unsavory details. Behind her polished veneer lay a world of debts and questionable deals. She had coerced the board into funneling money to cover personal bills, and she'd weaponized the HOA covenant to silence anyone who might pry too close. Her property was soon seized by the courts, pending the outcome of multiple lawsuits, both from the HOA and from individual residents. She faced not just the threat of jail time, but also the prospect of losing everything to compensate for the damages she had caused. When news of Karen's downfall spread, it felt as though a dark cloud lifted from Chestnut Grove. The relief was palpable. Now that Lucinda was gone, the neighborhood had a chance to rebuild a more cooperative, friendly environment. Walter Givens stepped down as well, partly out of guilt for allowing Lucinda so much unchecked power. A new interim board took over, comprised of fresh faces eager to restore trust. They immediately reinstated the monthly charity food drives, this time officially sanctioned by the HOA, with no more roadblocks. I offered my assistance and resources to help reorganize the drives, ensuring everything was done transparently and with enthusiastic community support. The philanthropic spirit thrived. Within weeks, the new board introduced more resident-friendly policies, eliminating many of Lucinda's draconian rules and fines. Neighbors who had once been silent suddenly found themselves empowered. They held small street parties, seasonal festivals, and open garage sale weekends without fear of retribution. Kids felt safer playing in front yards, and the entire area took on a renewed sense of camaraderie. One afternoon, as I walked down the street, I noticed a group of kids planting flowers around the neighborhood sign that read, "Welcome to Chestnut Grove, a community that cares." The irony of that sign still stung a bit, considering all that had happened, but now it seemed more genuine. This community truly cared again, free from the suffocating shadow of Lucinda Farnsworth. Lucinda Farnsworth, the notorious Karen, ultimately faced stiff legal consequences. With the evidence stacked against her, The courts handed down a multi-year sentence for fraud and embezzlement, along with hefty fines that forced the sale of her property. Her carefully curated facade of social respectability crumbled in the public eye. No longer the unassailable tyrant, she was now a cautionary tale about the perils of unchecked power. For Chestnut Grove and its residents, life went on, brighter than before. The relief drives continued, expanding to not just food donations, but also clothing and school supplies. The acts of charity that Lucinda had tried so hard to suppress ended up stronger than ever. The media coverage of her misdeeds had, in an unexpected twist, brought more donors and volunteers from all over the city. The once-doomed food bank project flourished. Personally, I maintained a humble presence. While some neighbors learned that I was a nationally recognized philanthropist, I chose to keep the spotlight on the collective efforts of everyone in the neighborhood. After all, the real hero was the community itself, the mothers and fathers, the teachers and volunteers, the everyday people who decided that enough was enough. In the end, Karen's downfall served as a reminder that tyranny only lasts as long as good people remain silent. When those people unite, support one another, and refuse to be intimidated, they can achieve remarkable change. Chestnut Grove, once overshadowed by fear, emerged resilient, a testament to the power of community and the importance of standing up to bullies, no matter how official their title might seem. It was a lesson that would long be remembered in the quiet, leafy streets of Chestnut Grove, a suburban neighborhood now thriving with open hearts and open doors.